The store is closed. Not for the night, forever. You walk to the clothing shop, and the windows are dark, and the shelves behind the glass are completely bare. No coats, no boots, no wool, no thread. Just empty hangers, swinging in the draft from a broken window. Your children need warm clothes for winter. Winter starts in 6 weeks. Modern people have never genuinely faced this problem. They have faced a bad sale. They have faced a price they could not afford. They have complained about shipping delays. But they have never stood in front of an empty clothing store in October and understood that what their children are wearing right now is everything they will have until spring. Behind the Iron Curtain, this was not a catastrophe. This was just October. Textile was rationed like food. Shoe leather was a controlled material. A winter coat was not purchased. It was inherited, repaired, modified, rebuilt, and passed to the next child and the next, until the fabric itself disintegrated. And when the fabric disintegrated, they replaced it with newspaper, with burlap sacks, with the hide of an animal they had slaughtered for food, with layers of salvaged wool so carefully maintained that a single garment lasted 30 years. Modern fast fashion produces a shirt that falls apart in 18 months and is designed to do exactly that. Soviet grandmothers produced garments that outlasted the Soviet Union itself. Stay with me, because number 5 on this list is the most counterintuitive clothing survival technique from behind the Iron Curtain, a method of insulation used in the coldest regions of the Soviet bloc that requires no fabric, no sewing, and no materials beyond what you throw away every single week. And it works better than most modern thermal underlayers sold for $60 in outdoor equipment stores. Let's begin. Number 1. The art of invisible repair. In 1962, in a textile factory town in Poland, a seamstress named Helena received her annual fabric ration. 2 meters, of course, will blend. That was the allocation for one adult for 1 year. 2 meters. A winter coat requires approximately 2.5 meters of fabric at minimum. Helena did not buy a new coat that year. She had not bought a new coat in 11 years. She repaired the one she had, with fabric salvaged from garments that had worn beyond repair in other areas, with thread unraveled from the worn sections and rewound for reuse, with techniques of darning and patching so refined that the repaired areas were structurally stronger than the original cloth surrounding them. This is not a romantic story about making do. This is materials engineering practiced under scarcity conditions. The Iron Curtain invisible repair system worked on a specific principle: reinforced before failure, not after. Soviet and Eastern European textile workers knew exactly where fabric fails first: elbows, knees, collar edges, cuffs, the seat of trousers, the toe box of a shoe. These areas received preventive reinforcement before they showed visible wear. A layer of woven reinforcement fabric, salvaged from worn garments, cut from canvas bags, taken from any woven material with tighter construction than the garment being repaired, was applied to these high-stress zones before failure occurred. The result? Garments that lasted not 2 or 3 years, but 10, 15, 20 years of continuous wear. The technique for invisible darning, weaving replacement threads across a worn area in precise alternating patterns that reconstruct the original fabric structure rather than simply covering the hole, takes practice to master, but requires only a needle and thread. Iron Curtain women learned this as children. It was not considered a craft or a hobby. It was considered basic literacy. Modern people throw away a garment with a hole the size of a fingernail. Soviet seamstresses rebuilt entire panels of fabric from thread and extended the garment's functional life by a decade. Number 2. Layering as a heating system. The modern outdoor industry sells technical base layers, mid layers, shell layers, and insulating layers as 4 separate products at 4 separate price points, totaling several $100s for a complete system. The Iron Curtain version of this system cost nothing, because it was assembled from whatever was available, and it worked on the same physical principle that the expensive modern version works on, because that physical principle is not proprietary. Dead air is the best thermal insulator available without specialized materials. The purpose of every layer in a clothing system is to trap still air against the body and prevent it from moving. Moving air carries heat away from the body. Still air holds it. Multiple thin layers trap more dead air than one thick layer of equivalent total weight. This is physics. It does not change based on the price of the garment. Behind the Iron Curtain, layering was not a technique. It was the only option. You wore everything you owned when it was cold, in order of thickness, with the loosest layers on the outside to allow the inner layers to retain their loft and trap maximum air volume. The specific Iron Curtain innovations within this system: newspaper as an insulating layer. A layer of dry newspaper worn between 2 fabric layers provides genuine thermal resistance. Romanian and Bulgarian workers in outdoor occupations wore newspaper liners inside their coats during the coldest months. This was not desperation. This was deliberate thermal management. Burlap and rough-woven sacks as outer shell layers. The coarse, open weave of agricultural sacking provides wind resistance when layered over softer garments, breaking convective heat loss. A burlap outer layer functions approximately as a wind shell, the outermost component of the modern technical layering system. Stuffed garments, dried plant material, dried grass, cattail fluff, dried moss, stuffed between 2 fabric layers creates a functional insulating layer on the same principle as down or synthetic fill. The material traps air. The air insulates. Soviet workers used all 3 simultaneously. They were not comfortable. They were alive. Number 3. Boot and shoe reconstruction. In the Soviet bloc, a pair of leather boots was not purchased and discarded. It was maintained, repaired, rebuilt, and resoled until the upper leather itself cracked and separated, a process that, with proper care, took 15 to 20 years. The cobbling techniques practiced by Iron Curtain families were not the specialized craft of professional shoe repair. They were household skills known to the majority of the adult population, passed down through generations in the same way that cooking and sewing were passed down. The sole wears first, always. The upper leather, if properly maintained, with animal fat or rendered tallow rubbed into the grain surface regularly, remains flexible and waterproof for years beyond the point where the sole has worn through. Resoling technique: remove the worn sole by cutting the stitching or carefully separating the adhesive bond. Prepare a new sole cut from any dense rubber. Salvaged tire rubber was the most common Iron Curtain source. Car tires, bicycle tires, industrial conveyor belt material, all provide excellent sole durability, superior in abrasion resistance to many commercial leather soles. Attach the new sole with contact adhesive produced domestically from dissolved natural rubber if commercial adhesive was unavailable, and reinforce the bond with hand stitching around the perimeter using waxed linen thread or any heavy thread available. A boot resoled with tire rubber and properly maintained upper leather will outlast an equivalently priced modern boot by a factor of 3 to 5. Water resistance was maintained with regular application of rendered animal fat, beeswax, or pine resin rubbed into the leather surface while warm, not sprayed synthetic treatments in aerosol cans that last 6 months. Soviet cobblers rubbed rendered lard into boot leather and achieved superior waterproofing at zero cost. Number 4. Wool maintenance and reclamation. Wool is the most forgiving textile ever produced by an animal. This is not sentimentality. This is materials science. Wool fiber has a natural crimp structure that gives it loft, the ability to trap air without mechanical processing. It resists compression and springs back to its original structure after deformation. It absorbs up to 30% of its own weight in moisture without feeling wet to the touch, managing perspiration in a way that synthetic fibers cannot replicate. It retains thermal insulating properties even when wet, unlike down or most synthetic insulations, and it can be reclaimed from worn garments, respun, reknitted, and returned to functional use indefinitely. Behind the Iron Curtain, wool garments were never discarded. They were unraveled. A worn sweater, too damaged to repair, was carefully unraveled, one thread at a time. The reclaimed yarn was wound into balls, sometimes retwisted with other reclaimed yarn, and reknitted into a new garment. The same wool passed through 3 or 4 garments across 2 or 3 generations before the fiber became too short to work with. At that terminal point, the short fiber remnants were felted, compressed under heat and moisture into dense, non-woven fabric used as insulating fill for patching, lining, or stuffed garment construction. Nothing was wasted. Material that modern people discard when a sweater develops a hole was treated as a resource with years of functional life remaining. Hand knitting, maintained as a constant activity in Soviet households, worked during any available idle moment, meant reclaimed wool could be converted back into garments with no equipment beyond 2 needles. Stop here. Look at the clothes in your wardrobe right now. How many of them have been repaired even once? Not professionally. Repaired by hand, a button resewn, a seam reinforced, a worn area darned before it became a hole. For most modern people, the answer is 0. The average person in a developed country discards approximately 37 kilograms of clothing per year, garments worn 7 times before disposal. An industry built on the assumption that repair is more expensive than replacement. Behind the Iron Curtain, replacement was not an option. The skills required for maintenance were universal. Write in the comments, what is the last piece of clothing you repaired instead of threw away? If the answer is nothing, this video is for you. Number 5. The newspaper thermal layer. This is the one I promised at the beginning, and it is strange enough that most people hearing it for the first time will assume it is an exaggeration or a misunderstanding of what actually happened. It is neither. Across Soviet Siberia, the Ural industrial cities, and the harshest winter regions of the Eastern Bloc, areas where outdoor temperatures regularly fell below -30 Celsius and where workers had no access to modern thermal underlayers, no budget for technical outdoor clothing, and no alternative but to stand outside for 8 to 10 hours in conditions that would stop a modern person within minutes. Workers developed a specific and repeatable technique for supplementing inadequate clothing with newspaper insulation. The method, dry broadsheet newspaper, folded to appropriate dimensions, worn in specific positions against the body surface between the first and second clothing layers. Across the chest and back, the core areas most critical for thermal regulation. Around the torso, sometimes wrapped and tied around the legs, under trousers. The thermal mechanism is the same as any insulation. Trapped air, the microscopic air pockets within the paper fiber structure, combined with the air trapped between the sheets themselves when folded, create a layer of still air between the body surface and the outer environment. Still air does not conduct heat efficiently. The body's own heat warms this trapped air and maintains an elevated microclimate against the skin. The limitation of newspaper insulation is moisture. When paper becomes wet from perspiration or external moisture, it loses its loft, compresses, and provides minimal insulation. Soviet workers managed this by reserving newspaper layers for static outdoor work, or short-duration, high-cold exposures where perspiration was minimal, and removing or replacing the paper during high-exertion periods. The performance comparison is more favorable than most people expect. Independent thermal testing of newspaper as an insulating material, conducted in engineering contexts entirely unrelated to survival applications, has consistently shown R values per centimeter of thickness that rival cheap synthetic batting materials. Soviet workers at the Ural metallurgy complexes were, in effect, wearing insulation rated similarly to budget synthetic fill assembled from the previous day's newspaper, replaced daily from the stack every Soviet household maintained beside the stove, at a cost of precisely $0.60 technical base layers from outdoor equipment stores used the same physics. Soviet workers used yesterday's Pravda. Here is what all of this means. The global textile supply chain is one of the most complex industrial systems in human history. Every node has dependencies. Every dependency is a potential failure point. Supply chain disruptions are not hypothetical. They have happened repeatedly in living memory. A global just-in-time system can empty store shelves within weeks when any major node fails. Clothing is not food. You will not die without a new coat in 72 hours. But in a prolonged crisis, in a winter where supply chains have failed and stores are empty, the difference between the person who can repair, insulate, and maintain garments and the person who cannot is not trivial. The Iron Curtain families, who maintained 30-year-old boots with tire rubber soles and animal fat waterproofing, were not living in poverty. They were living with a resilience the modern system has spent 70 years engineering out of the population. Because a person who can repair their own clothes and resole their own boots is a person who does not need to buy new ones. And a person who does not need to buy new ones is a person the industry cannot sell to. Save this. Learn one of these skills before you need it. Repair one garment this week instead of replacing it. The system that makes repair seem harder than replacement is not working in your interest. It never was.